Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. As Owsley said, I am Brandon McCormack, and I am a professor at the University of Louisville. It's so good to be back again this year. I had the pleasure of moderating a session last year on the theme of race and faith. And Sarah and I had talked about wanting to, in some ways, continue that conversation into this year so that just wouldn't be a one-time conversation, but we would keep threads of that conversation going. And so you will hear aspects of things that we talked about last year in this conversation as well. But I am very, very excited to be here for this conversation and this theme on changing story keepers, Millennials and Gen Z. And we should make a quick confession, as we've all laughed about this, that as you can tell by looking at me and the grays in my beard, I'm certainly no Gen Z. I'm right on the cusp of Gen X and Millennial, and we have Millennials on our panel, but we do not have a Gen Z person, unfortunately, although their voices are critical. And so I teased with Sarah and said, now, if there is some brave and bold Gen Z person in the audience who, when it comes time for the conversation after the presentation, who would like to join us, we welcome you when we will make space on our couch for you to join us in this conversation. But this panel on changing story keepers, I think it's interesting that it comes right after the panel that we had, Old Stories in New Contexts, in which the last question that was posed by the moderator is, where will sacred stories be found going forward? The idea that they would be found in between the cover of bound books, perhaps, certainly historically, has not always been the case, and it may cease to be the case. Where will sacred stories be found, and who will be telling them? And our dear Buddhist brother, in invoking social media, said that in this day and age of social media, of TikTok and Twitter and Instagram and other such platforms, the beauty of it is that in many ways everyone has a platform and everyone can be a storyteller. But then it came with a warning and a question. But what kind of storyteller will you be? Will you be the kind of storyteller who perpetuates divisions and hatred and greed? Or will you be the kind of storyteller that calls us to our more noble aspirations, that helps us to see our greater humanity, that calls us into the work of social justice? And I'm glad that those storytellers that are joining us on this panel this afternoon have certainly chosen the latter option. They are storytellers of social justice, and which is why we had invited them here. David Okri, a Nigerian novelist, once wrote, "To poison a nation, poison its stories. A demoralized nation tells demoralized stories to itself. Beware of the storytellers who are not fully conscious of the importance of their gifts and who are irresponsible in the application of their art." And I can say with full confidence that each of the storytellers and artists that you will hear from today are fully conscious of the importance of their gifts, so much so that they deem their gift of storytelling sacred. And they are so responsible with that sacred art that they have used it to call us to greater works of social justice in the world, so that we speak back to a nation of poisoned stories and demoralized stories and offer us a more expansive imagination so that we can envision otherwise worlds that we can all live in that are much more fully just. And so I do hope that you will help me to welcome our esteemed panelists this afternoon. As you will see here, Lyla June, Tsétsêhéstâhese, and joining us virtually, Storytellers. I have met each of them, whether years ago or only recently or by Zoom, but I know deep down in my spirit and soul that these are very special storytellers that we have in our midst, and we are very lucky to be able to hear from them today. And so without further ado, our first presenter will be Tsétsêhéstâhese. Tsétsêhéstâhese is the inaugural El Hebri Endowed Chair and Executive Director of Interfaith at Augsburg University. She has been a professor, expert practitioner, and public speaker for the last 2 decades in the fields of conflict resolution, interfaith studies, mediation, education, deliberative democracy, social, gender, and racial equity. That's a lot, y'all. Now, that's a lot. In 2021, she served as chief of staff for an elected official, and prior to that appointment was an associate professor of interreligious education for a decade at Claremont School of Theology. She is widely published in the area of interreligious studies, peace studies, and theologies of religious communities. Tsétsêhéstâhese.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. 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 In the name of God, in the name of God, in the name of God, the ever compassionate, the most compassionate, in the name of God, ever compassionate, most compassionate. Muslims begin every act we do, whether we breathe, whether we wake up, before we eat, before we give a talk, before we read the sacred text, before we walk to school, before we drive our cars. We start invoking the name of God and the compassion of God using the phonetic roots from Arabic, which are reflected in the phonetic roots from Hebrew of rahama, of compassion. And that compassion is related to, for those of you who know those languages, to the ancient vessel that God gave for the creation of human life, the womb. So we invoke that kind of compassion whenever we do, whatever we do. So I wanted to share with you 4 stories today, 4 stories that touch me in my life every day. The first story is from my young daughter. She's 14. Mama, I want to go to school in England. Why? Why do you want to go to school in England? Because there are no guns. You want to go to school to England because there are no guns? Yes, Mama. Because every day when we go to school, we don't know what will happen. That's the first story. The second story comes from my university. Augsburg University is one of the most diverse in Minnesota, and it comes from our interfaith scholars class, where we asked students to bring a sacred object to class. So I sat with them last week. 3 of the young Muslim students, leaders of their Muslim Students Association, pulled out their phones and talked about their favorite app to read the Quran with. And I thought, wow, we as scholars of religion are missing that. Some people are talking to God through their devices. It's not the notion that it's taking away from God. What if our devices, in fact, bring us closer? Is that something that we see and we talk about when we speak about how religion exists amongst different generations? So let me tell you another story, and this starts with a knock on the door. During the last administration, young people, particularly in the city of Los Angeles from where I come, activists who were working on issues of migration were targeted. We had vigils when people were deported because, as I talk about in my work, deportation is like a death for the family. You mourn, and children were plucked, parents were plucked while they were dropping their children off at school. So the knock on the door for many who were young activists in immigration and migration, that is part of the narrative. That is part of the story. Family separation, the trials of children 2 to 4 years old, even younger, standing for trial. That is part of our country's impact on young people. Another story I want to share. Freshly graduated from law school, moved to Los Angeles, went to law school in Bloomington, Indiana. My first case to do restorative justice. I walk into a room, there is a 9-year-old boy whose feet cannot touch the ground. The criminal justice system has already caught him at 9 years old. And I ask this young boy, what happened? He was hungry one day. He happened to take some money from the ice cream truck that came to his neighborhood. So if this young boy had not had the chance to come into this conversation where we were able to divert from the criminal justice system, and I asked this young boy, and the ice cream truck owner came, and we had a conversation, and guess what? She loves this young boy, and he loves her. And together they come up with a solution. Instead of moving towards the criminal justice system, this young boy gets to volunteer for her for a few hours, and they build a relationship. But that's only because there was an alternative that is not offered every 9-year-old boy who, out of hunger, has to take care of himself. That's the story of young people. It's not frivolity. It's not separation from what is holy and sacred. It is the reality that we live with a criminal justice system that incarcerates young people for so many different reasons, or honestly for no reason at all. And so I think about this when I travel around the world and I talk about what we do and the work that we do, and I have to tell people when children are in jail, and I have to start sentences like that, and I have to talk about that, and I have to talk about that reality. So I'm going to be brief today. I wanted to talk about 3 things that are so important in the work that have come to the narratives, whether as a professor, whether as a mother, whether as a storyteller, because I am all of those. And really, it's around care, community, and collaboration. So one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is this current generation in our future? Is this future mine? Is this future yours? Or is this future ours? Because we are banking on resources and incarceration and forms of structural violence that are creating conditions where we are leaving the world far worse for the generations that are coming after us, wherever you are in this time and space continuum. So have you appropriated your future for yourself and blotted out the future of those ahead of you? That is a question for all of us to ask. So I think about care and this idea of rahmah and what we're learning from young activists who are climate justice activists. So there is a righteous anger to extend that notion of care to living and non-living beings, whether from the Buddhist perspective of interbeing or from other perspectives where there is a sacred aspect to everything that breathes in this earth, that has a space on this earth. God tells us in the Quran, even walk gently on the earth, that we have to extend our care to the way we walk as Muslims. I can't stomp because the earth has a right over me that I be gentle on how I walk on her. So a young activist, an indigenous activist from Mexico, Mitzi Violeta, was asked, so tell us about your climate justice activism. And what did she say? She's angry at the adults, and what she says is, instead of talking about solving the climate crisis, they negotiate how to continue pollution. So instead of us solving the climate crisis, what's happening is a negotiation of pollution. All of these huge conferences and these gatherings, that's the perspective of someone who's at the table, who's 23 years old, who feels this urgency, that we wake up with. I was speaking to a colleague who's speaking on a panel tomorrow about climate anxiety amongst young people. And the thing is, sometimes with anxious thoughts, we can say, don't worry, that's not going to happen. I can't say that to my 14-year-old child. I can't say, this is not going to happen to the earth. So the reality of what we are building as a future and whether we are appropriating it for ourselves and blotting out, in many ways, the lives of others. The care extends to the criminal justice system and to people who, as many of us say, Mercy Oroyoyo says, it's not that there are voiceless people, it's that we have to learn to listen better. So youth justice activism in this country is an incredible example. Organizations all over Los Angeles are advancing policies and procedures and identifying methods in which incarceration is not the solution. Incarceration is not the intervention. So in many ways, that form of care, thinking about interrupting structural violence with other methods of care. There are so many examples that I can give you and the work that we do around that, but I will leave that for another time. Another thing that I think is profoundly important is that this idea of community, and this idea that community must be bricks and mortars. This idea that community means a membership in a particular form of a pew-oriented offering space. And I think we're reconfiguring in many third spaces, in the Muslim community nationally, in many communities, what is seen as a deficit, as a lack of affiliation. There are spiritual spaces cropping up amongst both millennials and Gen Z that are in many ways dealing with the reality that almost every denomination and religious tradition is facing the reality of clergy abuse. There are organizations being built by millennials like Heart amongst the Muslim community, responding to the reality that the safety of young people is not always guaranteed. And why are we not talking about that when people are leaving the pews? Why is that not part of the conversation? Why is healing justice not a part of our conversation? These are the conversations that come to me. And what I think is really incredible is we're focused right now on the youth vote with what happened yesterday. But consistently, again and again, what youth are telling us and what they're engaging in is not just the activism around elections or electionism, but we have an incredible contribution from so many young people around community organizing and organizing on issues after the ballot box, before the ballot box, and that we are building communities of care and collaboration that have yet to be recognized by many of us who study and utilize a language so that even when someone comes from a national office to encourage people on campaigns to say, in a pejorative way, get off TikTok, get off of those platforms. And what I wanted to remind all of us is we need to start to begin to see the sacred and the incredible activism and the challenge to religion, maybe even itself, that is coming down the line. And maybe that challenge is welcome because there must be new ways to build the sacred on this planet together. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Najiba. And we will have collective conversation after everyone is gone, but just to take a moment to engage each of our speakers quickly, immediately following their presentation. You raised this question, is this current generation in our future? Which I think is an interesting and provocative question. I'm a reader of and viewer of Afrofuturism and Afrofuturist texts, right? Which in one way is asking that question, as Alicia Wormsley puts it on her billboard, there are Black people in the future, right? There's this way of making that statement. I remember when the Breonna Taylor exhibit was at the Speed Art Museum, that statement was wrapped around the ceiling. And depending on which wall you looked at, it started in a different place. First, there are Black people in the future, and then on another wall, in the future, there are Black people. But on one wall, it starts, are there Black people in the future? Which turns that assertion into a question that had to be bagged in light of state violence against, right, Black bodies and the like. I wonder if you could say more about that question, right? The sacredness of the question that you're asking and how this notion of care, community, and collaboration helps us to, right, imagine possibilities for this current generation and our future.
So I think part of the question around future is a notion that time is linear. And what has been so important for me in my work is to understand that one of the great mistakes that was made in social justice articulation of movements was that the arc towards justice will bend as time progresses. And I think what has been, in the conversation I shared around with my 14-year-old, this idea that just because time progresses in a linear fashion doesn't mean things get better. And it seems like such a simple precept, but one that I had to really interrogate in the work that I do, and to understand that to see the future from a different vantage point, from a vantage point where the trust in systems that currently exist, I was wondering, well, why is my daughter so fearless? Why are so many that I work with, so many young people, so fearless? And it's not from this sense of they don't care, but it's from this reality that they've already lost everything. They've lost the realities that held many others in security. And so that precarity allows, but also makes imperative a sense of fearlessness. So I think to me that's something that I had the sense of comfort of time, of things getting better. It's not the case, and I think this is a transnational conversation as well, being someone who comes from, as a naturalized citizen, and I just feel like there is this inability to let go of the sense of the progression of time, and that is something that the sacred brings to this, to say that the battles that were fought 2,000 years ago, there's something to learn from them, but that I want my children to be ancestors. I want to give them the option to be ancestors.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next speaker and presenter is Story Michelle, who is joining us virtually. Story Michelle is a Black, queer, shape-shifting, non-binary femme, Afrofuturist performer, and storyteller. Their creative practice builds a present and embodied archive of Black femme futures and aliveness. Their art is in dialogue with Black feminist philosophers, activists, and African diasporic folk and futurist writers with whom they co-collaborate blueprints for navigating Black life and livelihood despite living in a state of perpetual and persistent precariousness, and yet coping, surviving, and thriving. Story centers these subversive narratives as methods for divesting from flat images and caricatures, evoking rituals of self-love, cultivating accountability within community, and learning from Black queer feminists who envision worlds beyond white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Story Michelle.
You can become a planet all by yourself, child. Already living inside you, you have the makings to transform, metamorphosize, swallow yourself whole, become you, not this you, but the you that's emerging. You can create that opening, you dig? It was dark when we arrived, pitch black. We had to follow the stars home. Soon we realized that the sky wasn't the sky at all. It was more like standing beneath the reflection pool. We could see our mirror image. We traveled home following our own lights. We became each other's medicine, sharing stories, laughing, crying, throwing all out tantrums, feeling angry, and recycling it as compost for our gardens. Together, we created abundance, dispelled the lies that we would never have enough. You see, if you want to accomplish impossible things, you gotta get creative, brave. What will you do when change comes? Complain? Pretend that nothing ever changed at all? Find distractions? Or will you adapt as nature has taught us? Change is all there is, child, all that matters. Open your heart, beloved. Feel through your guts. Breathe through your third eye. Listen. 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 Open your ears, beloved. Know that as these words flow through you, you breathe life into me. We are never alone. That was an excerpt from Mama Rose, a solo performance, which is Afrofuturist, circular, time-traveling, and centers the relationship between a non-binary teen named Sid, their trans archaeologist grandmother named Mama Rose, and their mother, Dolores, as they journey together to find intergenerational healing, mending wounds. This work is important to me because I realize that healing comes from not just outside, but really inside the family dynamic. Mama Rose is communicating stories to Sid through VHS cassette tapes from the future, a future time where Mama Earth is restoring herself and really doesn't need our help. But Mama Rose finds it important to communicate these messages to Sid so that they can find self-healing and self-care for themselves. This generation is understanding what R.J. Lord told us many moons ago, that self-care is our resistance, that loving yourself means more than anything else in this world, especially despite social dynamics, messaging that we hear from inside and outside our communities. We will now hear Sid's response to Mama Rose through a song named Gonna Love Me for Me.
In me, I can't discern them from my own. She walked a life on a tightrope, danced in fields of smoke and guns. And I try to fit them over her, but I break it every time. Can't seem to speak my mind. What's the use in trying? Reaching towards the ceiling to touch the sky. Wonder if I reach it, cause it's so damn high. Mama better watch me, learn them facts. Gonna wings. Gonna love me for me. Yeah, yeah. Gonna love me for me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gonna love me for me. Yeah, yeah. Gonna love me for me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gonna love me for me. It might not seem so apparent sometimes, but you're never on your own. This world got me feeling claustrophobic. I refuse to show it. Won't know who I am until I face my fears. Yeah. Won't know who I am till I face my fears. Mama better watch me. Mama better watch me. Mama better watch me. Gonna smile my way. Watch me. Yeah. Gonna love me for me. Mama better watch me. Mama better watch me. Mama better watch me. Gonna smile my way. Watch me. Yeah. Gonna love me for me. Yeah. Gonna love me for me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gonna love me for me. Yeah. Gonna love me for me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gonna love me for me. Gonna love me for me. Gonna touch the sky. Gonna wonder if I reach it, 'cause it's so damn high. Mama better watch me. Gonna learn it fast. Gonna learn me for me. Yeah, gonna love me for me. Gonna love me for me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gonna love me for me. Gonna love me for me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gonna love me for me.
That was the conclusion of my presentation, Brandon.
I wanted to be sure. There might have been more to say.
Yes.
We were all wrapped in caught up in the song and in the performance and the storytelling. That was a beautiful performance that you just provided us, and talking about Mama Rose and Sid being on this intergenerational journey towards healing, right? And so we're talking about changing story keepers and what it means to imagine the next generation, but I love how you're creating this intergenerational conversation, that it is not just what's happening in the previous generation and what's happening in the next, but there is this exchange between them. And I was particularly struck by Mama Rose's narrative when Mama Rose says, we became each other's medicine, telling stories. And I thought about that in light of what I opened with David Okri's statement that to poison a nation, poison its stories, right?
Yes.
But then you give us this idea that also through storytelling, we become each other's medicine, right? And then that can happen in an intergenerational way. I wonder if you might just expound on that notion a bit for me.
Absolutely. This actually comes from a personal space. My grandmother is 97, and I've spent the majority of my life interacting with her, engaging with her. She lives a full life where she's been a minister, a social worker. She's seen so much change over our landscape of being America and over our landscape of being human. And those conversations that we have are very sacred to me. And in many of those conversations, those things happen where we'll laugh together, we'll cry together, we'll be angry together. And those are also spaces for our own personal growth. As I grow, she grows as well. And as she is going to be transitioning into my ancestor soon, I know that I'm going to be carrying on those stories for her. Her stories have become integrated with who I am. And I think that it's important for us to remember that the future is not just the future. It's this remixed hybridity of past, present, and future. And that even if we don't know it, we still carry these remnants of the past, of the present, of what we believe the future will be in our own limited imaginations, we carry that with us every single day. And it informs the way that we move. It informs the way that we see social justice. It informs the way that we live. It informs our rituals, our daily rituals that we have every day. And so I realized through these conversations with my grandmother how important it was for me to understand who she was as a human, who she is as a human in her late 90s, who she believes that I'm going to be, has become that much more important to me. She always tells me that even though I didn't become a minister and follow her footsteps, that I do have a ministry and that my stories are a part of that ministry. I'm realizing that social justice isn't just on the front lines, it's everywhere. It's about how you treat people. It's about hospitality. It's about the care that Najima spoke about, community care. How do we look after each other? How do we listen to each other? That listening, I think, is the key to understanding each other's stories and being able to retell them in a way that we're not just seeing, but that the people whose stories are a part of that narrative are also seen and heard.
Thank you so much for that rich answer. Our third speaker, Lyla June. Lyla June is an Indigenous musician, scholar, and community organizer of Diné, or Navajo, and we pre-gamed this backstage, and I said, now you gotta help me pronounce this, and Lyla was very gracious and said, you are going to mess it up, but you have to at least try, and I appreciate that spirit. So, here we go. Tsétsêhéstâhese. Yes, or Cheyenne and European lineages. Her dynamic multi-genre presentation style has engaged audiences across the globe towards personal, collective, and ecological healing. She blends studies in human ecology at Stanford, graduate work in Indigenous pedagogy, and the traditional worldview she grew up with to inform her music, perspectives, and solutions. She is currently pursuing her doctoral degree, focusing on Indigenous food systems revitalization. Lyla June.
Okay. Hello. Oh, there we go. Ya'at'eh, greetings. Shik'eh, ado shid'neh. Greetings, my kin and my relatives. I'm so happy to be here. And I love the slowness and deliberation with which you read our bios. It's refreshing to just slow down for a little bit and rest in. And I love the things that you shared too, opening up this panel, especially the quote you shared about to poison a nation, poison their stories. I feel like I'm gonna riff off of that right now for a while. But before I do, I wanna honor my traditional way of introducing myself. In the Diné way, we're also incorrectly known as Navajo. But we say, to start off, we say, Ya'at'eh shik'eh ado shid'neh, greetings, my relatives and my people. My grandmothers taught me to see all people as my people, regardless of where they're from or what language they speak, to fight for everyone as if they are your people. And then we introduced our first clan, which comes from our mother. So, in American culture, you get your last name from your father, but in our culture, you get your last name from your mother. So I say, Tsétsêhéstâhese Tchachitni Nishla, which means I am of the Tsétsêhéstâhese Tchachitni clan, of the Diné nation. Diné people are indigenous to what is now known as New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, but we call it Dinétra, Diné-Bakeya, the people's land. And we share it with our beautiful Pueblo relatives, Numu relatives, our extraordinary indigenous nations who are our neighbors. My second clan is my father's mother's clan. So that would be the Tsétsêhéstâhese, or the Southern Cheyenne. She was from Anadarko, Oklahoma. My third clan would be my mother's father's clan, which is Tsétsêhéstâhese, the salt clan of the Diné. My fourth is my father's father's clan. The patrilineal side is sort of the last one mentioned, which is of the European clans, Scottish, Scandinavian, other stuff I might not even know about. But Akwit Ego Diné Aninishla. In that manner, I present myself as a Diné woman. So, getting to this topic, this subject of, you know, and I'm just gonna walk around if that's okay. I'd like to be closer to people. This subject of storytelling and changing stories and new stories and storytellers, whom I'm so honored to be with each of you today, to sit beside you on this panel. I think that for Indigenous people, as you can imagine, our stories, where do we begin, right? We've been misrepresented in Hollywood. We've been misrepresented in textbooks. We've even been misrepresented to our own selves, growing up in these American schools, learning the wrong history about ourselves. So my generation is carrying on the work that our elders and our foremothers have done, which is to correct the record, to help educate not just America, but the entire world. Because America has been the one relaying all the information about us to the world. So we are in a process of deep re-education. There's a million different ways we're doing this, right? But my PhD research is looking at the indigenous land management that occurred here in what we now call the United States, but which we generally prefer to call Turtle Island. America comes from the word, from the name Amerigo Vespucci, who we know was documented to look for people to enslave and gold to extract. That was his official business. So I should say, I can't speak for all Native people. We generally do not like to be called Native American because we don't want to be named after him. And similarly, we don't want this land to be called America because this land is about kinship. It's about interdependence. It's about generosity. It's about humility. It's about abundance. All of these things are the opposite of what Amerigo was taught as a child and what he came to embody. And so for this reason, we prefer Turtle Island, which, speaking of stories, comes from a Haudenosaunee story when Sky Woman fell from the sky and landed on a turtle's back and worked with creation to create this landmass we're on, to plant those seeds of corn and beans and squash and amaranth and all these beautiful foods that we have. So, but in terms of Turtle Island, you know, the ways in which this land was managed is what I want to talk about. We often envision indigenous peoples as half-naked nomads in a tribe huddled around a fire or maybe a teepee. I love teepees. I think they are extremely incredible, sustainable technology, but we don't understand that there were like thousands of teepees in a camp at a time. We had massive civilizations. Some of the largest cities in the world, when Columbus was born, you would think were in Europe, but they weren't. They were here in Turtle Island and South America, or Avia Yala, as they're starting to call it. And so we had these massive cities, and we also were not transparent on the landscape. We were not simply looking for a berry to eat or a deer to hunt to survive and eke out a living. We were actually architects of abundance. We actually worked with various ecological systems to produce incredible abundance. Right here where we're sitting in Kentucky, there used to be chestnut orchards all around us. These chestnuts were a primary staple of the indigenous civilizations. In the 1800s, they almost went completely extinct because Americans did not know how to manage chestnut groves. So indigenous peoples managed chestnut groves by spacing the trees far apart so the disease would not spread easily. Also burning in between the trees every fall. A lot of our lunar calendars, the fall moons are called the grass burning moon. So we would burn in between the trees to recycle those nutrients back into the soil, turn those dead plant tissues into ash, which would in turn bring fertilizers to the soil. It would also, bringing that charcoal into the soil, creates little apartment buildings for microbial organisms, so it created living soil systems. And then in their wake would sprout up nutrient-dense grasses. So in between these chestnut trees, you had meadows, you had grasslands, and all the early colonizers say time after time, it looks like a natural park, like a park just was naturally created here. They didn't want to give credit to the native peoples who sculpted that park over thousands of years. There's a soil core just down the road that was pulled out of a Kentucky pond that shows the fossilized pollen of chestnut moving in 3,000 years ago. Like there was no chestnut in the record, and then all of a sudden 3,000 years ago, this chestnut influx comes into the fossilized pollen record right here in Kentucky. You also see fossilized charcoal come in right at the same time, indicating that this food forest, which included hickory nut and walnut, was managed by routine indigenous fire. And it's beautiful to think that this pollen stays in the record for 3,000 years straight. It never died. So these people managed to take care of an extraordinarily abundant food system for 3,000 years straight right here, which goes directly against the dark and bloodied ground theory, right? This idea that there was no native people here. They just would come here to hunt and then they would leave. That is a really cute story. Used to say, oh, we didn't steal any land from anyone because nobody was here. This is a colonial story, the dark and bloodied ground story. So we are, my generation and my foremothers and forefathers and four ancestors, they have been working very strongly to correct the record and say, no, we were here in great numbers and we managed this land extensively. We were not savage, we were not primitive. That denigration and that label was used by colonial forces to legitimize the way they treated us. Because if they're not really human, then it doesn't really matter if you kill them, right? 98% of our people were wiped out within the first few decades of contact. And so this is how we as colonial society, we sanitize our past, right? We say, oh, there weren't very many here. There weren't very many native people here. They didn't really have civilizations. Oh, and they came across the Bering Strait, so they're immigrants too. The Bering Strait theory has been unequivocally disproven. They just found human footprints in my home state of New Mexico, 23,000 years old. We weren't supposed to be there then, according to the Bering Strait theory, but we were. So I could go on and on, but I'm actually out of time. And I am so happy to just give you a little taste of the vast, beautiful world of indigenous land management, the vast, beautiful world of history that has been hidden, and the excitement that we get to be the generation that changes the legacy. We get to be the ones that change the story. We get to be the ones to unearth these stories. We get to be the ones to find peace. I love that you work in peace and conflict resolution, because that will be the science of our times. If we can get that science down, we will survive as a species. It's actually not the science of rocket ships that's going to save us, or the science of sucking carbon out of the air. We need to learn the science of peace. And so I'm so honored to be that with you all today and to work towards that with you all today. I'm very, very honored to be just one more warrior with you in this army of love, to bring healing, to bring peace to our lands, and to make our descendants proud. So thank you so much.
My goodness. Lyla, you said so much. It's hard to know even where to begin to ask you a question in this moment, but I'm really struck because you started by saying that you wanted to riff on this idea that to poison the nation, you poison the stories, which is to say what you've just shared with us is that it is a story poisoned from the beginning because we continue to tell a colonial story, right? And you're trying to offer us a corrective story, a counter story about the ways that, as you say, Indigenous people have been misrepresented to this nation, to the world, and even to yourselves. And you're in this process of re-education, right? And trying to re-educate your communities and the world with a different set of stories that are about, as you say, kinship and generosity and abundance, and not the kind of stories that we tell in capitalist America of competition and scarcity and lack and greed, right? But when you engage in that work of re-education, right, you run up against those who will not allow for those counter stories to be told. Those are the stories that get banned. Those are the books that get banned. Those are the ones that get called unpatriotic. Those are the ones that get called critical race theory, right? Those are the ones that are disallowed to be told, right, in this place. And I'm glad that you name where America comes from, right? But we cannot tell those stories about Turtle Island in this America. I wonder, how do you persist in this work of re-education, given all that you're up against and trying to re-narrate a story that's been poisoned from the beginning?
Well, you could give a whole hour answer to that, but briefly, I think compassion is important. To be compassionate. People are scared to let go of their stories. We all are, let's admit it. We have stories we use to survive. Some of them aren't true, I shouldn't say all of us, but I sure do. Most of us have some kind of stories that help us get up in the morning that might not be true. And so you have to be gentle. You have to be compassionate and understanding. If someone is taught their entire life one thing and you're challenging that, understand that's what you're doing. It's a big deal, and even though their story might be completely inaccurate, and there's no argument about that, it's just obvious, you still want to have compassion and gentleness and unity, because we're all in this together, no matter which side of the table we're on or which part of the imaginary pyramid we're at. We are all in this together. And the healing of our own history is not just about my liberation. It's equally, if not more, about the liberation of colonial society. Because who wants to be an oppressor at the end of the day? And deep down in their spirit, I don't, although I've done it, I do it all the time. But that's not what I want. So when we realize that my liberation as an Indigenous woman, Black liberation, Muslim liberation, the liberation of every single beautiful piece of this puzzle, every single strand of this tapestry of humanity, is also equating the liberation of colonial society, so we can be what we really are, which is family. Then I think that incentivizes people to want to learn about this more. Secondly, I think it's really important to contextualize things, You can't just say, oh, Amerigo Vespucci was a bad guy, This man is the spear point of 2,000 years of open war in Europe. The Roman expansion, the Inquisition, the burning of women as witches, the British destruction of Welsh, Irish, Scottish peoples, the warfare that was going on created that scarcity story, right? Because if in that area of Europe at that time, you better get it or someone else will. And that's real. It was survival. So when they brought all those ways of seeing things to this land, you have to have compassion for them, where they're coming from. The amount of suffering, the Black Death that wiped out a third of Europe overnight, the amount of torture chambers that these folks were coming from. You have to understand that hurt people, and colonized people colonize people. And so I think compassion, understanding, gentleness, and love and unity are obviously going to facilitate this truth-telling process.
Thank you. I believe at this point there is a performance that we will have, and then we'll come back and have some conversation together amongst our panelists. And if there is that Gen Z person in the audience who is brave and bold and wants to come and join us, please.
Well, I just have to say this has been incredible to be on the receiving end, and we're only halfway through with your part. So I'm speechless as it relates to what we've just been through, and thank you so much. And I forgot to do a job that I was supposed to do earlier, which was to introduce, so that I wouldn't be doing it now, the interlude. But it is my great honor to introduce a group of, I believe, very fearless women who are all connected to a place that I should confess I too am connected to, which is the Kentucky College of Art and Design. We are a new college, but we are very much inspired by all that is being discussed here. And I will now turn it over to this incredible team to give you an interlude from the Kentucky College of Art and Design.
Hello, thank you so much. So I have prepared some words to say, and they're on my paper, so I'll read them. But what I didn't realize is, I'm just so thankful to be here. This is so awesome, to be even on this stage with these people. So I'm so excited to be here. My name is Jenna Seiler, and I am an assistant professor at Kentucky College of Art and Design, or as we call it, KICAD. And my job really today, which wait, hold on. I didn't know it. There we go. I didn't know it was already up for me. My job today really is to introduce two of KICAD artists and also to highlight two projects that we see fitting within the larger theme of the session. But before I do that, before I introduce our artists, I would just really like to thank everyone for being here. And I would like to thank the Kentucky Foundation for Women because they've sponsored this presentation. And I would also like to thank Sarah and Mandy and the entire festival team because they've worked with us to bring us here today. And we're just really, I'm really excited to be here. So thank you all. And now I'll get on with the business of introducing our artist. So Mackenzie Taylor is a KICAD alum, and I'll just sort of highlight, even though she'll come up next. She's a KICAD alum. She graduated last spring with her BFA. Utilizing a variety of media in her work explores identity, history, and home as a Black woman. The piece I would like to highlight today, which is available for viewing in the lobby, and you all should definitely go see it, it's really quite amazing, is titled Confection. This work consists of a loop video showing a close-up of Mackenzie, who is seen sucking away sugar coating that covers portraits of her grandfather. While Mackenzie works to resolutely break through the translucent sugar veneer, her mother's voice reverberates across the video and in your ears, catching from time to time a moment or a fragment of a man Mackenzie never knew. Next, I would like to introduce Yesenia Avila Ugalde. Yesenia is a senior at KICAD, and she's a diligent and reflective artist. She is also an extremely fierce graphic designer. And the piece that I would like to highlight today is a body of work that Yesenia is currently working on. To create these meticulously arranged compositions, Yesenia has drawn upon personal photographs, family traditions, and also her research into Mexican medicinal plants and healing practices, and her love of her own community here in Louisville. The smallness of these paintings at first belies the fullness of their subject matter and their impact. Even in these early stages, as you can see up in our PowerPoint, in these early stages, the work seemed to beam with the liveliness of coming together around food and drink and blossom with the bountiful potential of community and herbs. So with our very, very short time, what I would like to do now is actually invite each of the artists to come up and reflect on this question. So taste seems to be to offer a way to connect to both of your heritages. What role do you see taste and heritage playing in the work just highlighted? So we'll have Mackenzie come up first, and then Jacinia.
Thank you. So heritage is a great part of my work. Honestly, my identity begins within my home. I live in a generational home, so I was able to access my grandmother and my mom telling me constant stories of who my grandfather was, and I wasn't able to meet him. So how do I identify with someone who I was never able to meet? I began listening to them, just hearing oral stories constantly over a photo album. And a lot of times I just sat there and was able to like consume just a little bit of who he was. But the more and more I consumed him, I felt like I didn't know who he was at all. Each photo I had of him was sugar-coated. So I felt like everything was sweet and intimate that my mom had told me, but I never fully got like the good and the bad, the wild, the crazy. Everything was just sweet every time I heard it. But I feel like my genealogy I was able to consume just through storytelling and through photo albums. And that's it.
Yay, thank you.
Buenas tardes. So for me, taste is a perception of experience, but flavor is the personality behind the experience. And that's where my heritage comes in. In Mexican culture, flavor is kind of like our signature of caretakers. Our common ingredients have medicinal properties, they have lineage, they have history. Mexican flavors travel across countries, it touches different dishes. But when you're a Mexican immigrant in Louisville, Kentucky, almost 2,000 miles away from my motherland, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, we yearn for that heritage. But we find it, like in other flavors, we taste for remembrance, and we share for community healing and community care. So the pieces that I'm working on highlight those flavors that I found while building community. They also highlight medicinal herbs that are very common in my family and the environments that were highlighted in the paintings are located here in Louisville, Kentucky. So 2,000 miles away from our motherland. And for me, that's where my heritage flavor and my own healing comes in. So thank you all so much for listening and inviting us to share our art and what it means, because as we hear, there's a lot of need and yearn for community and healing, and I hope that my pieces at least uplift that a little bit through a smile or a memory that we can all share. But yeah.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.
Yes. And before you go, you young people, you Gen Zers, I presume, and if you're not, you certainly look it. You are welcome to stay, invited. We will make room for you on this couch if you want to stay and hang out with us a while. Yeah? No need to just be an interlude when you could be fully integrated into this conversation. Yeah?
Now we are not false advertising.
Look, I mean, so this is a broad strokes question, and then I think we'll push it a little bit further. But I'm just curious of each of you. And did we lose Storé? All right, we'll wait for her to come back. We will imagine that she is in the future and that she will teleport back to us in the present here shortly. I'm just curious how each of you imagine your particular mode of storytelling or art making as sacred, right? What makes it sacred? What makes it not just important, but sacred to you and to the communities in which you work? But then also, how does that sacred storytelling do a particular kind of work for social justice that maybe other modes of activism perhaps doesn't do?
I was going to answer you're the poem. So I'll go ahead and do that.
Absolutely.
So this poem is called Love. Some of us are not allowed a personal crisis or time to fall from grace. We are too busy plugging the holes in the dams, holding back the crushing of our communities. And then, in that moment, we forget we have hearts too. Hold, and that we have bodies crushable. There are days to know that the bodies that make communities must be loved. These are the days to know that the bodies that make communities must be loved, cherished, even coddled sometimes. We cannot do people building if the lines of people made in this imaginary are so cut open that every wound walking into this room does not even know its own pain.
Yes. Thank you. I love poetry. I need poetry. So what makes our stories sacred, and how does that address our social issues in ways other activism does not? Gosh. I mean, to me, everything's sacred. This cup is sacred. Your hair is sacred. This breath, this moment is sacred. This beautiful art that you are doing is sacred. And our blood is sacred. Our words are sacred. So, you know, back in the day, the anthropologists came to my people and they thought we had no religion. But actually, it's just that the ceremony never stopped. We just were always in the ceremony. It wasn't like, oh, now we're gonna pray, and now we're not praying. Like, no, life is one big prayer. And each day is a ceremony. And there are ways in which we honor that, formalize that, and support that ceremony. Whether it's the way we tie our hair, which I didn't do today. My grandmas would be a little upset. Or the way we give cornmeal at the dawn. But so, I guess to me, it's hard to answer that question because I think I strive and fail every day, but I strive to make everything I do a prayer. And so I love how you're saying at the beginning of everything, your people speak these words. They honor the Creator, they honor the compassion of Creator. And because it's almost like they're reminding themselves, like, this is sacred. This is a sacred moment. And I think if we could live that way again, imagine what the world would be like, you know, when every action, every event is sacred. So what makes my stories sacred is the fact that they're in this universe, that they're in this sacred universe, and that they're existing in tandem. Even our pain is sacred. Even the way we hurt each other, I would dare say, it's a very dangerous thing to say, but I would dare say is sacred in that it gives us an opportunity to forgive. It gives us an opportunity to learn unconditional love, to love those who harm us. Do I want harm in this world? No, absolutely not. But it can become medicine when we approach it with that desire to learn unconditional love. this whole story is sacred. The story of what's unfolding all around us, the story even of the climate crisis, is part of our story of upheaval, collapse, and rebirth, which my people have already been through. And many times. And so even collapse is sacred because it's one of the greatest teachers. They could give us graphs and charts all day about the climate crisis. We don't care, apparently. But when that hurricane comes on our door, whew, that's gonna teach us more than any graph. When we see our child go hungry because we have these unsustainable food systems, collapse can be sacred. It can be a teacher, a crucible. So I think that our stories can do things in ways that other activism can't, because stories are easy for people to connect to. Just like all the stories you taught us today, we can identify, we're human. So I think that, and if those stories are written with compassion, the world can't help but shudder when they hear them. And so I think our stories can do things that other things can't. They can move the human spirit. So I'll pass it to you if you want to share anything.
I would say our stories are sacred because a lot of times they may feel like super unique to you, but you also might meet someone and be like, oh, I also can relate to that in a special way. A lot of times I have an art piece that it's about pennies. My grandfather used to collect pennies. And I met someone else who was like, yeah, my grandfather also collected pennies. So every time I would see a penny, I connected to him. But I just feel like everything is sort of like innate when it becomes sacred. Like you just don't know what it is, but I have a connection to this for some reason.
For me, I think sacredness is kind of rooted in storytelling and the preciousness that we preserve. Like, there's a fragility for me when it comes to being sacred. Like, it needs extra care, extra attention. It's super special. And I actually have two art pieces, and they're both portraits of my parents, called The Hopeful, the Divine, and The Consequences. And I made those along with that title to bring back a sacredness into ourselves. You know, we talk about self-love. If we can see something as faith, as sacred, we should also see ourselves as sacred. And when you do that, you have that self-love, and that turns into community care, and then that turns into seeing everything as sacred for me. You know, everything from the little ladybug that might, fall on your hand, to things that you don't see. That's where the sacredness and just looking at life with care, with that fragility, that's kind of like where you also see that we're all one, like it has been said, and then you care on a different level. You show care for, and you show like this drive for justice. And so everything can be sacred. So everything can be looked at as sacred and have the same care, and deserve the same care as all lives, from a ladybug to something that you can't see.
Story.
Yes, I just want to say that all of your responses are just filling me up with joy. I'm so grateful that we have two, are you Gen Zers or Millennials?
I was born in 95. Oh. I was born in 98.
95, 98.
Okay.
I think those
Yes.
are official Gen Z, right?
Yes,
in
Gen
categories.
Zers. Yeah, I'm so grateful to have you with us and to be able to hear your words. Bell Hooks talks about griots and how the griots would have this ritual of telling stories But before they were able to tell the stories, they had to glean from the margins. They had to glean from what was not happening in the center of everything, but what was happening around, listening to whispers, to gossip, to stories, to all the things that we wouldn't necessarily consider to be important, but that's what made them all the more sacred, because it's not just what's happening at the focal point, it's what's happening around it. It's what's happening in the lives of people that aren't centered. And I believe that what makes the stories that I wish to tell sacred are the fact that it comes from Black queer folks that are often not centered. It comes from having conversations with folks that have different intersections that are seen as unimportant or aren't invited to the table. But that's what makes their stories that much more meaningful, because they get to see and experience and feel what it actually means for these laws, for these monumental things that happen to us, what it actually feels like and how they survive them. I think that the stories of survival, the stories of, like someone mentioned, the ladybug, right? The ladybug also is surviving. That ladybug also is experiencing aliveness, what it means to be on that leaf and eat and to feel safe or secure. Those are stories that also feed us. We are able to learn more about how to live abundantly, how to find our own spaces of safety, how to be able to listen to each other more keenly. I believe that leads to our healing, and it gives us the sacredness that we all already possess.
Yeah, thank you all for that. So as we talk about this panel is changing story keepers, right? And we think about perhaps the ways that some things have shifted and changed in the stories themselves, perhaps as the story keepers have changed. Is there a way that you see kind of the changing of the story keepers to millennials and Gen Z folks? Is there something about the sacred stories that we've inherited that have perhaps shifted or expanded? Now you talk about, right, the experiences of Black queer folks now being part of the sacred stories that we tell that perhaps a generation ago would have never been told, or they would have not been the ones who are the story keepers, right? So is there something that has shifted that you see as millennials and Gen Z folks are the keepers of the sacred stories, that they become more expansive? Or on the other hand, on the other side of that, as was alluded to earlier with social media and TikTok and certain platforms encouraging certain kinds of stories and not others, do you also see something perhaps that has been lost that came from, that should have been kept from Mama Rose, that, right, Sid perhaps lost hold of in the media of transfer? So to recap, is there something that has shifted and changed about the sacred stories as they've changed hands from one generation of story keepers to the other, whether that's positive or perhaps negative or a little of both?
Yeah, I believe that there's been a couple of things that took place that have allowed, especially Black queer folks, trans folks, to be able to speak in the way that we do now. One of those things is that, as I mentioned before, self-love, learning to love ourselves first so that we can be more open and bold, but also creating more communities of care around what it means to be Black and queer or gender, non-binary, in ways that we can feel safe amongst each other. Creating extended families has become a way that we can be ourselves and stand firmly in who we are and share those stories so that we know how to survive and hopefully to find that aliveness, right? Where we're not just surviving or coping or trying to navigate, but that we can thrive, that we can be amongst one another and see each other. That has not been an easy path, though. I think that we have had many ancestors before us that have done the work of in social justice in ways that they have protested, they have lobbied, they have paved such a beautiful path for us. And I believe that in many ways, we lift them up as our ancestors in that way. As Mama Rose is an ancestor for Sid, Sid is able to find that confidence in themselves. It's through that, I believe, like exchange of confidence and seeing each other that has allowed us to thrive. Social media has actually been effective in this way, where many people thought that they were going through things on their own. They were the only ones that felt this way. We're able to see others that were living similar to them. I'm not saying that we're a monolith at all, we are not, but it has allowed us to expand our perspective and our viewpoint of the many different possibilities of what it means to be queer, the many possibilities of what it means to enlarge the way that we see the way that we are living, the way that we are functioning as human. I also think that social media has made it so that in many ways, there are gatekeepers for what it means to be queer. And so we do see some areas where there are people that are very tight-knit about the way that queerness is expressed. And that is something that perhaps is difficult for some people to navigate, to live fully outside of those gatekeeping experiences. But I think that for the most part, social media has expanded not just Black queer folks' imagination, but people's imagination about what it means to live fully as our unique selves.
Thank you. I think you were trying to jump in a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how photo albums are kept now. They're all on the phone, so it's not like you have easy access to history, like experiences. Living with my mom, we didn't have any photos up of people, but like when I went to go live with my grandma, it was tons of photos. So I was constantly asking her, who is this person? Why are they so important that they need to be framed and put up in the house? Also, like, I would talk to my grandmother and she would talk about how she wasn't able to ask her grandparents about their history. But now that I was able to ask her about her history, she could tell me as much as she wanted to. It's anytime she felt like I needed to know this, I don't know, this street, like Magnolia, why was this so significant to her and why should it be significant to me? But I just feel like the way that history is stored, it isn't always like openly, like I guess advertised or given, because everything's in a closed book or in a phone, in a flash drive. It's just not open anymore.
I would say,
Go right ahead.
I just in agreement. There are a lot of secrets that have occurred in past generations because they haven't felt safe or comfortable to share. And I have experienced similar things with my grandmother being able to share things with me that she doesn't feel safe with communicating with my mother.
Thank you. I was thinking of one of the things that was lost in translation as we changed story keepers is just pointing out the fact that we're all speaking English right now, you know? What's all of our indigenous languages here? It's not English, right? How crazy is that, you know? And what do you lose when you get, when you basically have to be an English story keeper to be able to even relate to the wider world? And what does it mean that I can't speak Diné? You know, I can speak quite a bit, but I can't fluently speak it. What do we lose? Because those languages have so much wisdom encoded in them. Like even just the word k'eh, you know, k'eh in my language means interdependence, compassion, being there for each other, community, being connected to your ancestors, how to relate to one another through the medium of love. All of that's packed into k'eh, you know, and we don't have a word for that in English. So what do you lose when you become Americanized, when you become anglicized? And it's just so challenging to get back to it, as we all know, right? It's language shift and language loss is something that Native folks and around the world, we don't know what to do with it. Because it's like we literally are watching our languages going extinct in front of our eyes with the elders dying. Like, oh, there goes the last speaker. We're literally watching it and we can't find a way to stop it. So we really need government support. We can do it on our own. Don't get me wrong, we can do it on our own. But if we had government support to make these languages official languages of Kentucky, official languages of New Mexico, how would that change things, you know? So I don't know, that's just one thing I think about is like, when we lose our mother tongue, you know, well, what does that mean? And how does that change the story? Because then you can only speak the story within a certain construct to begin with. So anyways, thank you.
And I think there's something that struck me, that part of the goal of a scholar, of a storyteller, of an artist is to name the wound, and that we can't heal until we name the wound. And so much of the political contestation over the story of America is about the erasure of the wounds that were created. And I think about how much this festival is important in re-scripting the story of Louisville, in re-scripting the story of who is here, who's up here. And I found out my father spoke here at this festival twice, in the 90s and then in the early 2000s. And there's something about that that's really powerful about the gender of the person that would represent the Muslim community and who's here now, looking at who's on this panel, who might not have been here when this started. I'm just pointing out the story of this festival is the story of Louisville and who is at the table and who's not at the table. And I think that naming of the wound is so powerful because whenever we try to heal before that wound has been exposed, it continues to fester and it comes back and it doesn't heal. And that's part of the powerful aspect of the work that we all do, is naming that wound and figuring out how deep it went. And sometimes you have to go on for layers and layers. And I want to point out that so much for those of us, I come from a part of the world that was contested in borders. I've always felt a precarity around my borders coming from Kashmir. And now being in the US, when we lived in an administration for a period of time where we would find out if we were banned or not based on a tweet the next day. And I've talked about this in my lectures. I want to point out how so much of the stories are also around borders and land and moving people across borders, taking them from one land to another, leaving one land, coming to another land, and how so much of even our conversation and the ownership of land and how it led to the ownership of so many other things. There's something about this conversation of healing across generations and multi-generational pieces that really is tied to how we construct borders, the state, and I think about our undocumented brothers, sisters, and others who don't have the right to have rights. And they're also in this city, and they're also here, and they may be in our audience, but you can't speak up if you don't have the physical right to have the right to be recognized by the state. And those are stories that are also sometimes dangerous to tell. And if you come from an Asian American background, we know, for instance, many who experience incarceration as Japanese Americans, sometimes those stories were not shared with next generations for the fears of what it would mean to carry that pain. So sometimes what's changing is we are asking to name that wound, and I'm asking my elders to name those wounds, because I understand that when they didn't say it, it was the exposure of it may have taken away rights or safety, or also just the care that they were trying to give to us.
So I thank you for bringing up language. That, you know, as someone who, my Spanish is really broken, that we have a saying that it's like, if you don't eat beans, you forget Spanish. So you have to eat beans to remember Spanish and keep it in your being. But I think about memes. When it comes to my generation, I think about memes and how they tell a different story in kind of like a better light. And it's more memorable, it makes people laugh sometimes. And it's a very interesting and creative way of storytelling. And it's so relatable. A lot of the things and stories that are shared on social media, I think have been stories that have been kept away from people for a very long time. There's always good and bad in things, and especially in technology and man-made tools, but the way my generation has creatively expressed themselves is like, wow, I'm glad someone's doing it. There has been narratives that have been uplifted and light shown on them that otherwise, if this tool didn't exist, they would have never had that exposure, that saying of it's okay, like there's other people that feel the same way. I keep thinking of one narrative in specifically that's like the No Sabo kid, which is the I don't know kid, and No Sabo, it's like me doesn't know. So it's like a broken Spanish, and it stems from Latino parents sometimes being really hard on the little kids about what is this, you know, like, you know this, like trying to help them with homework. And the kid is like, I don't know, like, but it's like no sabo, it's broken Spanish. And those kids, like, I've seen it in my own household, and I've seen the impacts on mental health. So that narrative being uplifted in social media, where a lot of other kids that went through the same thing can relate to, it gives them that agency of kind of like owning it and transforming it. So we're transforming these narratives that were once very traumatic, very hurtful, that we really didn't know what we were doing to each other, or, you know, family. Was the implications of the I don't know, the me don't know kids. And, you know, we laugh about it. It's in our culture to kind of tease a little bit, but it's part of that narrative and uplifting all of these voices that otherwise they would have still, you know, had, I think, a harder time healing in community and finding people who also relate. But it brings back that language, you know, that broken Spanish that it's, you know, it's identifiable. Now we have Spanglish, you know, where we dwell, or I can dwell very efficiently between the two. Like there's a lot of words that I don't know the translation for in English and vice versa. So I just say it in that language. And it creates my own narrative. It contributes to the narrative of my generation of, you know, I'm not from here and I'm not from there, so like, where do I belong? But we're creating that path of belonging, and we're welcoming other people through all of these creative tools, including memes.
This has been so rich. And how do you even respond? To our panelists, to our KICAD Gen Z friends, Thank you all so much for all the wisdom that you shared, for the stories that you have shared with us. It is evident to me that our sacred stories are in good hands and that you have shown us what is possible in a nation full of poison stories. And we thank you for the gift that you are and the gift that you bring to the world. Please join me in giving our panelists a hand.
Thank you. Ironically, I can't sing a sacred song right now because we never record our songs. They're always done in a different type of context, but I'll sing a different one that I wrote. Indigenous people, shine your light, we are equal, yeah, yeah. I remember the days when our prayers were illegal. I remember the days when being Indian was lethal, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we had a rough past, but get ready for the sequel. Get ready for the glorious comeback of our people, oh, yeah. Rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I could feel it in my heart, can you feel it in your blood? I could hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up. All nations rise, rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's our time. With forgiveness as my bow and my prayers as my arrows, pull it back and let it go. I watch them fly like sparrows. Have hope, have hope. With compassion as my shield and faith down to my marrow, we will walk the pollen path even when it gets narrow. Yeah, yeah. Resurrect. Yes, you can bet that we seen the single mama raising children on the res. We seen domestic violence tear apart what we have left. We seen the alcohol take it all and leave us dead. We've seen the children take their lives when they can't take the dread anymore. Can't take the dread anymore. Or no, we won't take the dread anymore. 'Cause we can't take the dread anymore. Yes, it's a war, but we seen it all before, and now we know we can change it, 'cause that's why we were born. We know we are the ones that we have been waiting for. Yes, we are the ones that Grandma has been praying for, so rise up. All you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I could feel it in my heart, can you feel it in your blood? I could hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up. Pueblo hermoso, levántanse, es nuestro tiempo. No tienes que esconderte más, porque ahorita es nuestro tiempo. This next verse is in Spanish to honor all the indigenous peoples who live south of the imaginary border. And even though Spanish isn't their indigenous language, a lot of them speak it, so I'll speak to those relatives too. Mujer indígena, tú eres tan sagrada y traigas medicina de tu suelo todavía, a pesar del abuso de tu cuerpo y tu tierra. Respetamos tus ancestros y la suya cultura, hombre indígena. Tú eres honorable y yo veo la fuerza que todavía sobrevive a pesar del abuso de tu raza venerable. Yo respeto tus ritos, tus danzas, tus padres, guerreros del amor y guerreros de la paz. Sí, no vamos a escondernos más. We are warriors of love. We are warriors of peace, and we will not hide ourselves anymore. All nations rise, rise. Rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's our time. Yeah. Thank you.